welcome back to the Lois Shepherd Podcast, episode 41 with Pastor Jay and Travis Welch. We're going to get into chapter 6 today of Ephesians. Last week we talked about the relationship between husbands and wives submit to your husbands, and husbands love your wives, and all of that is actually just a portrait, an illustration, a metaphor, if you will, about Christ and the church and how that reference, that illustration works. Today we're going to talk about children and parents and slaves and masters. And so he's going on with this continued theme about, like we talked about last time, about how the rubber meets the road, about how you live your daily life walking in a manner worthy of Christ. And so picking up in chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, for this is the first command with a promise, that it may go well with you, that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, that he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him." All right, well, like I said, we got these two different sections here stemming out of the household codes, as they're called, and dealing with husbands and wives last time. And then the next important step in the family structure of society, both then and now, is the relationship between parents and children. And so he says, "Children, obey your parents." And all parents go, "Amen."
Yeah.
Let's just end it right there. Children, obey your parents. For this is right. And then he quotes, of course, one of the 10 Commandments: honor your father and your mother. And then he has, my version has it in parentheses, "for this is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land." The word there is honor in the commandment. It's not obey. It includes obedience, but honoring goes above and beyond obeying, because you can obey and not be honoring to your parents. You can grudgingly obey. You can, obey with a bad attitude, throw a fit about it, whatever. To honor your mother and your father is about showing the reverence and the respect and the honor that is due to them as being in that position of authority over the children. And so, as we talked about with the husbands and the wives, as we talked about the societal structure of ancient Roman Empire in the first century that the Ephesians would have been dealing with, this is the basic structure and the order of society, and everyone had sort of a place in that society, and they all had subordinates, and they all had people that were superiors that were over them. It was less a matter of value as sort of we think of it today, and more a matter of position. In the same way that, if I'm speeding down the road and a police officer pulls me over, he is not a greater person than I am. He doesn't have greater value than I do, but he does have authority over me. He is my superior in that he is, in a position of authority above me. And so, in that same sort of way, everyone in society had a place and a person and authority that was over them. And so that was the understanding and the structure. And even, like I said, even in modern society, we have the same sort of thing. Whether it's a police officer, whether it's a government official, whether it's the president, so on and so forth, although it's a little watered down in our society because of democracy, much less so under an empire where the emperor was sort of the ultimate authority there, or a king in a monarchy type thing. But, children obeying their parents was an important aspect of maintaining order within the family structure and in a civilization in ancient times, as well as Roman times as well. In fact, you go back and you look in the Old Testament, there was, anybody that was disrespecting their parents got stoned. Yeah. And so, we're not talking about just, saying a word to them. We're talking about dishonoring them.
Not
because
corporal punishment, but capital punishment.
Yeah. Forget spare the rod, right? Spare the stone. But like I talked about last time, there was in ancient Near Eastern civilizations, this concept of honor and shame was very, very strong, and anybody that disrespected their family, like put a cloud upon the entire family name, their entire reputation. And so it was a much more important aspect of society than we deal with in our modern American cultures. But children, obey your parents, honor your mother
I
and
like
father.
the way he puts there's a reason for obeying your parents, for it's right. This is the right thing to do. Here's the thought that I have with that. You see, like the last lesson, we had this whole wives submit to your husbands, husbands love your wives. And there is that order in which God has in place, the husband, the wife, the children, and all that kind of stuff. And the children are to obey their parents. But see, this can get all turned upside down, and it has been turned upside down. No longer do, submission is supposed to be a bad word. Wives don't submit themselves to their husbands. If anything, the husband is expected to be submit to the wife in that understanding of it. And children are not obeying. Children are running the home. Children are running the nation, kind of a thing. And so things are all turned upside down. Now it's no longer the father that's the head of the house. It's the children who are the head of the house and everything. And so
the inmates running the asylum.
Yeah, and we're being submissive to them, kind of a thing. But it just says, obey your parents, and then he gets into the honoring your father and mother. There's a limit to that obey, because, my children are now like 30 years old. I got 3 kids, and 2 of them are up in their 30s, 35 and stuff like that. Well, them obeying me, fat chance of that ever happening, kind of thing. My influence over them kind of, it diminishes as they get a little older. And once they're married and out on their own, out of my house and stuff, so they're not going to obey me like, and I can't expect that of them like when they were in my home. But they are still expected to honor me. We just went through Father's Day here, some time back. How wives and children will honor their fathers, and even your father who has maybe passed on and already gone to heaven, you still honor. You always give them honor, but we're commanded to honor our parents, and there's a promise that's even connected to that. So the obeying part, there's kind of a limit to that in a sense, But the honor part, we are just told to honor our parents.
Well, and it's important, too, that it says right there in verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord. And just like he went back in chapter 5, verse 21, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Husbands, love your wives as is right in Christ.
Right.
Wives, submit to your husbands as you do to Christ. And so all of this is we remember that the ultimate source, the ultimate head of everyone is Christ. And all of us should submit and should be honoring and should be obedient to one another out of reverence to Christ, not as a social construct of men greater than women, parents greater than children, any of that kind of stuff. We submit to one another out of reverence for Christ.
But we're not even submitting to Christ. That's what we've got to be.
Well, in society now.
That's our point. We need to be submissive. That's why I'm talking about embracing that whole submissive kind of a part. But obey your parents, children. Let's get to the honor part, the honoring your parents. What about if your parents don't deserve the honor? In your mind, you don't think they deserve the honor. Maybe they're not even saved. Maybe they were abusive to you or something like that. I don't have any idea. Those cases. I've heard people say, I've read these passages to folks, and I said, Jen, there's some kind of bitterness toward their parents, and maybe for just cause or reason. But you mentioned something about honoring your parents, and they get, they're put off by that, and they won't do it. But it doesn't matter. There's no qualifier there. You still have to honor your parents.
Yeah, honor them whether they're worthy of that honor or not, right?
Mm-hmm. And then it'll go well with you. And he's even got a promise there of long. You'll live long on the earth and things like that. There's a benefit that comes to honoring your parents. So whether you think your parents deserve it or not, that's not the issue. You're still commanded to honor your parents.
Well, and it's just as I preached here a while back, like you said, on Father's Day, I actually talked about, God relates to us as a father That's how he wants to be seen, as our Heavenly Father. And he established fathers on the earth to sort of represent God to their children.
Right.
And so I talked about to the fathers about how, that should be a humbling concept to all, earthly fathers, that we represent God to our children. And that's how, and I've talked to people before, whether they've had abusive fathers or absent fathers or whatever, that actually negatively influences their ability to be able to connect and relate to God as their father. And so that's a problem. And so if you get to, let's see, verse 4, it says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord." So, fathers, don't provoke your children to anger. Don't poke them just to poke them. Bringing up children in discipline and instruction of the Lord is out of love and respect for them, not out of, you're going to do what I say or else.
Yeah, it's got to be reasonable.
Yeah. And if you're, I should have looked this up. I can't remember where it is now, where it talks about don't exasperate your children. Don't make them be weary with your criticism. That might be in Colossians where he talks about it as well. But don't wear your children out trying to meet your expectations of them. He's saying, look, raise them up in proper discipline and instruction of the Lord, but don't poke them. Don't just keep prodding them just for the sake of prodding them. Treat children. And that's something I'm always reminded of too as a father. Sometimes it's easy for us to see our children as sort of objects that are there and they're just there to obey us. But children are people too. They have their own ideas, their own wills, their own emotions. They're not just some sort of automaton or some sort of robot that stands over there in the corner. And so, yes, their ideas of what they want to do might be wrong, and you have to teach them lovingly and how to correct them what they want to do, but you can't treat them as if they're not people. And so that's an important thing for fathers to remember. You're talking to people. Yes, they might be wrong in their expectations. They might be wrong in how they're behaving, but they're not. You shouldn't treat your child any differently than you would treat another fellow person.
This teaching them to my translation says to nurture, to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. You've got to teach them that. You talk about that will of God business. You've got to teach your children the fear of God, not just the love of God. God loves you and all that kind of stuff. But you've also got to talk about the fear of God, and that there are consequences to your action, and there are disciplines that come. And when they're young, as a father, it's up to you to administer the discipline and all of that kind of thing. And it has to do with their will. You mentioned they have their own will and everything. But see, as adults, we're supposed to be submitting our will to God the Father, right? These children have to learn that you are their father. You see, they learn this stuff at an early age so that when they become adults, they'll be submitting their will to God. Right now, they're submitting their will over to this is what mom says. This is what dad says. You obey your parents, kind of a thing. And if they don't learn that, how to obey now, the police will be showing them how to do it when they get older. But they learn that discipline now.
All right. The next section deals with. My version says bond servants. The word is actually slave. Obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ. Now, this section is hard for us in our modern culture and our modern understanding for two reasons. Number one, we don't have the same sort of bond servant structure in our society that they had in the ancient times. And number two, and probably a weightier problem, is we, of course, in America have the issue with slavery that we had, 100 years ago. For basically the birth of this country, and for the first, several hundred years of its existence, we dealt with the issue of African American slavery, chattel slavery, and how those people were treated, not just treated as slaves, but treated as animals and treated in a very, very harsh and negative way. We have that history bearing on us in the background of our mind. And so when we read this passage, we have a very different response to this than of course, Ephesians would have had. And once again, we have to condition ourselves to be able to read this as the first century Ephesians would have read this and understood this. The system of slavery that existed in the first century Roman Empire was very, very different from the system of slavery that we had in America. And that's why, I mean, like I said, my version says bond servants instead of slave. It's, you would have a situation where you would have someone who owed a debt and, they couldn't pay that debt off. So what they would do, they either would work themselves or they would sell, their children, whether it be, their daughter or their son, into bond service to a family to work for a prescribed number of years to pay off that debt. And so in a sense, it's more... if we're looking for something comparable to our modern day thing, although it's not exactly the same, it'd be more to like an employee-employer sort of status. They worked for someone to pay off money, to pay off a debt. Now, sometimes there were forced slavery, whether it was a conquered people or enemies that were defeated in battle. They could be forced to work as slaves, as bondservants. Which is a little bit closer to the system that we think of. But even then, it was a much, much different system than the slavery that existed in America. And so it's hard for us to get outside that idea and that image, because when we hear slave, that's immediately what we in our American context think of, 1800s and Civil War and all that went with that. And that's not the same thing. And so if you think of it more closer, even though it's not accurate, but closer to an employee-employer type relationship, you're getting a little bit closer to the ancient context here. But he's saying, slaves, bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would obey Christ. There it is again. You're obeying them and you're submitting to them out of reverence for Christ. You're submitting ultimately to Christ first, and then you're submitting to them out of reverence for Christ. And then it's interesting here because he says in verse 6, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So he's saying, you're not doing it just to look good. You're not just trying to get people to say, oh, look, what a great servant. You're doing it out of sincere reverence for Christ. You're doing your best for God, not for Ben. Rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. Yeah.
Well, no, it's just it's exactly on the right track. The way I'm looking at this is that singleness of heart. Whatever your vocation is, whatever your employment is, whatever task is before you, whatever work you do, you're not just working for your employer to draw a paycheck. I mean, there's a testimony and a witness for the Lord that's being shown here in the way that you carry yourself in the workforce, in the workplace. Mm-hmm. There's a difference between the way a believer handles a situation and a non-believer handles it. You get in these work environments and everybody's fussing, cussing, carrying on, backbiting, killing one another, mm-hmm. Jealousies and all that kind of stuff. Well, that can't be us, We have to do a singleness of heart. I'm here, yes, and God's making provision for me through this vocation. I get a paycheck, but I'm doing my work as unto the Lord. And it's just as important that you take that as Pastor Jason is preparing and delivering a message and preaching a message and things like that to honor God. Your vocation is supposed to honor God and everything as well. And your work, everything that you do is as unto the Lord. You're trying to please Him. He had that word there, men pleasers, not as, what it says, not with eye service as men pleasers, mm-hmm. or something like that. You're just not out there to be seen and trying to please men. You're trying to please God in what you do.
Well, it comes back to motivations as well. And I've said this before about, the difference between a Christian doing good works for God and just a good person, quote unquote, in the world, doing good deeds in the eyes of the world, is our motivation. Our motivation is love of Christ, love of God. And so I'm doing a good job in my workplace, whatever that setting situation might be, out of respect and reverence because I love God, not because I'm looking to get approval or looking to get a pat on the back or looking to get a promotion or anything like that. Those things might come with that for doing a good job, but ultimately my motivation is to serve Christ and to be honoring to Him.
And the way you carry yourself reflects upon the Lord. You go into your work environment as a believer, and they're aware that you're a Christian, that you are a believer. Some of them hate it. That they just hate it. And they may they may make your life miserable in there, and because they want to see you break and everything. They want to see you in there fussing and cussing and carrying on like everybody else. But you go in there and you're making a difference. You see, you're light in the dark place kind of a thing. And so you do your work as unto the Lord, and people notice that. They see that. And your behavior reflects upon Christ. And this is our part in advancing the church, the gospel, and things like that.
Well, very similar to what we talked about with husbands and wives,
Right.
and then just now with children and parents. The honor, the submission, the respect that you show to your masters or to your employer, your boss, or whatever, is not dependent upon their behavior.
Yeah.
And that's the important thing to remember. They could be the world's biggest jerk, but you as a Christian, as a believer, are supposed to be honoring and respectful to them and do your best for them anyway, because you don't do it for them, you do it for Christ.
That's kind of like honoring your father and mother when you don't necessarily think they deserve it. You still honor them.
Yeah,
And the
they
same
might
thing,
be the worst father in the world, but you as a child are still supposed to obey them.
Yeah, and so the same thing
Your
comes
husband
down.
may not be loving, but you're still supposed to honor and
him.
respect him. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side of that, verse 9, masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening. Know that he who is both their master and yours in heaven shows no partiality.
Yeah, they're not getting by with anything. They're not
Yeah,
getting by
and so
with their
once
abuse.
again, back to the social order in the first century Roman Empire, even the emperor, I mean, everyone was submissive to the emperor, but in the Roman system, even the emperor was submissive to the gods. Everybody answers to somebody, is what he's saying. It's like, hey, they might be your master, but they've got a master over them that they've got to answer to. And so masters, you need to remember, you're held to a higher standard. You're going to answer to a higher authority as well. So remember that, and don't mistreat your servants. Don't mistreat your slaves.
Yeah, he talks about that. No, don't forego this threatenings and all that. You're not supposed to be in there mistreating your employer, your employees, or threatening them or anything like that, because your master in heaven, your master also in heaven, neither is there respect of persons with him.
Oh, yeah.
There's a verse somewhere, I think Jesus said someplace that that the measure of judgment that we use is meted back to us.
Matthew 7,
yeah,
probably.
something like that. That's kind of the same kind of a thing. Listen, this the threatenings and if you're abusing those under your authority, that same thing is going to be rendered back on you. So you keep that in mind. You got to treat people with respect and
Well, and I love
dignity.
that last part there where it talks about, there's no partiality with God. He's like, even though they're a slave and you're the master, I'm not going to show you any greater respect than I'm showing them. Everyone's equal in God's eyes, and so there's no partiality. There's no, bias. There's no prejudice one way or the other with God. And so he treats everyone equally. And so we need to remember that even what we would consider in our human eyes the lowliest among us is just as equally valuable to God as the loftiest among us from human perspectives. And so, all right.
All I can say is that we got to be living it. It's more than just we say we love Jesus or we say that we're a Christian. This spills over into our home, our relationship with our wives, our relationship with our family, our children, our employers. And just like Jason said, this is where the rubber meets the road kind of a thing. We've got to live it. We've got to be who we claim to be and live it.
All right. All right, well, next time we'll get into the armor of God, or the spiritual battles at the end of chapter 6 here, and we'll be finishing it out here in a couple of weeks probably. So All right, we'll catch you next time. Have a great week.